All right, for those of you who don't know me, I am Steve Carpenter. I'm the Michael J. and Aimee Rusinko Kakos Dean in the College of Arts and Architecture at the Pennsylvania State University. And it is my distinct pleasure to have this conversation this evening with Brian Alfred, Associate Professor of Art in the School of Visual Arts at the Pennsylvania State University. Your attendance here tonight is really important because it means that you are interested in the work that we do in the School of Visual Arts and the work that we do in the College of Arts and Architecture. And Brian, I believe this is the fifth in our series, ongoing series of conversations where I sit down with an artist or a scholar or an artist scholar or scholar artist from the college. And we talk about their most recent book publications.
Am I the first podcaster?
You are the first podcaster that I know of.
Okay. Yes.
So we don't have to put the that I know of in the official transcript. But yes, you are the first podcaster. Yes. So with that, in that regard, I'm a little intimidated because you know your way around microphones and one-on-one conversations, and I'm just recently becoming acclimated to it. What's the hardest part about doing a podcast?
The hardest part about it is, I would say it's equally booking it and editing it.
Booking it, meaning getting the person to agree to show up?
Not getting them to agree, but the logistics of it, of organizing it, is, believe it or not, like the conversations and that's the fun part. That's the easy part, is just talking to someone. It's really the logistics of it. It's the planning, it's the scheduling. That can be tricky because I do one every week. So and I do other things, so it's always, and I use no assistants. In my life, in my studio, in the podcast, I don't have any assistants, so I do it all myself, and I'm not the best scheduler or booker in the world, but
I'm a pretty good booker. That's my first name, by the way. Yeah.
Nice. Well,
thank you. Well done. You set me up.
Yeah.
So I'm interested to know more about the podcast, and before we go into that, I just want to remind folks, the book we're talking about is Why I Make Art, Contemporary Artists' Stories About Life and Work, and the book is a written form of, or written version of, many of the podcasts that you've conducted, and you actually interpreted them, you reinterpreted them. I mean, it's not the word-for-word transcript, which is
not at all
something people might assume is the case. Oh, I'm going to open up the book and just read the transcripts. You don't do that. As a matter of fact, you essentially tell the story of the interview in a really compelling way. I mean, any of those could be just stories about each of the artists. There are quotations in there, and you pull out what they've said, but you contextualize what they've said. So it's actually a really, I like the word actually because it sounds like you have some skepticism. It's actually a really easy read because it reads like you're telling the story that's informed by their life. It's really well done.
Thanks.
In that regard.
That's nice to hear because it would have been easier to just use transcripts and not write it. So it actually was a lot harder to make the book this way.
Yeah.
But I think, and when I was initially batting around the idea of writing a book, I thought, oh, well, it won't be that bad. I have all this content. I can just use a lot of, because I thought there's all these great things that people are saying that over the course of like listening to a podcast, you hear it and then it kind of goes away, but it would be nice to have a collection of all that stuff, all those great quotes and themes. So I thought, yeah, it's just a matter of going through and digging out some bits of gold in these conversations and putting it together. And somehow I had to write. It happened to where the format of it was just going to make more sense, and it was going to be more compelling, I think, to actually write about a certain group of artists, write a little bit about my experience, and then have some of their quotes pulled out of that. So it's kind of a combination of those elements, and I think it worked out that way.
Yeah, I think
the hardest part too was, or one of the hardest parts was, I can only pick so many artists to feature. Like I couldn't write about every, and at this point when I did the book, I think it was over 200 episodes. Now I'm almost at 500, but it's like, okay, who do I pick? How do I do that? So that was tricky too.
Yeah, had you not made that down select, this yellow book would have looked like the yellow pages. I mean, it would have been about this thick, right? it would have been, and probably people wouldn't have wanted to pick it. I mean, it would just be really unwieldy. So 5 years of podcast, is that it? How many years have you been doing the podcast?
I started it in 2016, I believe.
That's
so almost
8 years.
Yeah.
Wow. One a week.
Time flies.
Time flies. So talk to me about this. One a week, you do it all. You understand how microphones work. You understand how sound mixing and balancing works. You understand how recording works. You understand how to upload podcasts. You didn't just jump right into that. You had to do research for about a year or so before you actually started the podcast. Is that correct?
Yeah, like the R&D for it was almost 2 years.
Almost 2 years.
Although I was in a band. I played music my whole life, and I did a lot of home recordings, dealt with microphones, musical instruments. Mm-hmm. I was lucky enough, our band recorded our second record at Steve Albini's studio in Chicago, which was like, mecca for microphones and audio acoustics and recording. So I had a background of sound, so that helped. I think if I came to it completely cold, it would have been a lot more difficult. And I'm savvy enough with the computer and with sound to make it work. Mm-hmm. I don't know that I edit. I don't know if I'm the best editor, but the great thing about the format of the podcast, I want people to feel like they're just in the studio listening to two artists talk, not like a hyper-produced podcast. So it works that it's a little less edited in the sense that it's a longer form conversation. Most of it's in there unless there's big hiccups or a fire truck pulls up next to the studio where I'm recording or something like that. Sure. But it's pretty much, there's not a ton of editing that goes on, but yeah, so, and in that R&D period, I actually, Rishikesh, who wrote the foreword to the book, he does a podcast called Song Exploder, which is like, I think it's the best music podcast in the world. And it's, it's a Netflix show now too, so he does that side of it as well. But he kind of gave me some advice, which was a great resource.
Yeah, no, it helps to have people who understand that space that you're entering into. And I've listened to several episodes of the podcast, and it sounds like they're just two people talking, and like you said, you're being in the studio with them, or being in whatever space you're in with them. And I know initially you just interviewed people in and around the city, in and around New York, who you knew. I mean, you became comfortable enough that you said, okay, I want to start interviewing people, and you just started reaching out in that local geography. Some of those interviews were the early ones, I guess, were easier because you knew the people, and then you started to branch out to folks that you didn't know so well. Yeah. Talk to us about the difference between talking to someone who you know pretty well and someone who you don't know, although you're talking about visual art.
Yeah, at the beginning, I think maybe I leaned a little more towards people I know, not because I felt like it was going to be more difficult to talk to people I didn't know, but it was more like they'll say yes to me. And then and then there's a rapport there to where it won't be awkward in a sense. Because I kind of knew that, okay, I've been, at that point, if it's 2016, I've been like 17 years living and working in New York City as an artist. So I got to know a good amount of people and had a lot of friends who were artists. So, okay, I've got this pool of people that I could just say, hey, do you want to do a podcast? And at that point, I think podcasts were a little bit on the radar, but nowhere near what it is now. So, but people would agree to do it. And it was nice because I think after, the first podcast I did was with Shara Hughes. And I had known her for years, and her partner, Austin, is a really good friend of mine. And she, at that point, she kind of was really gaining a lot of steam in the art world, like showing and getting a lot of press and doing really well. And I think, in those first few interviews, I interviewed a few people who were pretty significant, who had a track record. And I think that helped maybe recruit some people that I had no relationship with. And they were like, oh, well, you talked. And hopefully, too, the fact that I had been working, as an artist for like 17 years in the city, that people like, oh, okay, he's just another artist, so I'll do it.
Yeah.
So generally, even in the early days, I rarely got a no, I don't want to do it. But there's just some people who don't want to talk. They don't like to talk in a microphone. They're sort of phobic of that. And they'll say, you know, I love your podcast, or I like your podcast, but, you know, I just don't feel comfortable. But generally people said yes, which was great.
Were there any people who said no initially, and then after a while they came around and said, okay, I'll do it. I still don't feel like talking to you on the microphone, but I'll do it.
Yeah. There's been I'd say a handful of people who maybe were reticent at first, or they said, oh, well, let me think about it, and then eventually they do it. And a lot of times it's a lot later, and I think some of their friends have done it, or they listened to it and enjoyed it. And then there have been people who will be like, oh, I really like your podcast. I'll talk to you, but I'm super busy right now. And then I'll go a year. It's all in DMs. Like this is almost all Instagram where I'm contacting people. So I'll look through and be like, oh, I'll see someone has a show, and I'll be like, oh, I wanted to talk to them, and I reached out, and they said in the future. So I'll DM them and be like, hey, it's been a couple years, just checking in. And they'll be like, oh yeah, I didn't get back to you. Eventually they'll say, yeah, I don't feel comfortable doing an interview, but thanks. And but that's rare, to be honest. Most people say yes.
Most people, well, it's another way for them to get their work addressed, for them to get word out about their work and to gain additional visibility.
Yeah, see, I think, if anything, because I don't think the podcast is necessarily good. Like, I don't think I'm good at it necessarily.
Well, then we're leaving.
I think the reason artists like to do it, I think, is because for most of us, when we're interviewed or when we are asked about our work or us as artists, we have a very brief spell of answers, of time, or it's certain questions, like they're pretty rote. It's like you're going to get the same sort of questions. What is this work about? Why the figure? Why do you use red in all your paintings? Whatever it is. It's like the same. And this is a chance for artists to like talk about where they grew up, what their parents were like, what their art school experience was like. When do you hear artists talk about that?
When I listen to Sound and Vision.
And I think that's part of the reason I started doing it, is because I was driving here to teach. It's a 4-hour drive at best. And I was listening to a lot of podcasts because they're long form, they're conversation. Books on tape sometimes, we're talking about this today, books on tape sometimes will put you to sleep because someone's just narrating a story. So it's just me talking like this over. But a conversation is active. You don't know where it's going. There's different cadences to the voices, so it kind of keeps you more awake. So I was listening to long ones because it's a long drive. And I thought, oh, it'd be cool to hear, I don't know, like Shara Hughes talk about her life. And at that point, there were really no, I think Bad at Sports was like the only podcast that I knew of that was like an art podcast that was kind of had been around for a while. But it was so, no offense to our Chicago friends, it was so provincial, and I didn't know a lot of the artists, and it was just different than the style of podcast that I had in my mind. So I think that's really why I did it, is because I thought, let's give artists a chance to talk about their life, because most artists are kind of interesting, or lead an interesting life to get to. I mean, you don't normally sit in a white box and make pictures of things or build little things if you're boring.
Usually,
So they usually have a story to tell, but you don't ever really hear it. I think even in museum shows, if an artist gives a lecture, you hear a little bit about their work. Then it's the chronological sort of, the slideshows that I sat through in school, all the same pretty much. Here's what I was doing in grad school. We used to have slides that went in, and that's why I'm doing this. Like, you would hit the thing and the next slide would go.
That's why in PowerPoint we call them slides too.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah. But it was kind of the same sort of chronological talk through. And then when I started giving talks, I would throw in, because at that point it was like, you could use laptop. I was throwing in video and other content to try and make it a little more interesting than just that chronological thing. Ironically, now I do a podcast where it's very chronological. I ask people about where they grew up and walk through their life.
I would say the podcast does that. I mean, that's kind of your format. But as the conversation goes on, you or the artist refer back to some things that they've mentioned earlier. So it's kind of reflective. So I think the chronology is necessary. The chronological approach is necessary to build a foundation. But I don't think it's as formulaic as we might think.
One of the best things, speaking of that happens in a podcast is, and this rarely happens, it's like a little nugget, is if I say something like, oh, well, maybe because what you were talking about earlier about with your parents or growing up, and maybe that's why your work does that. And they're like, oh, I never thought, like when they have a light bulb moment, that feels really amazing.
And that's not rare. I've heard it several times in podcasts.
Yeah.
Your podcast.
Yeah, that's kind of a lucky thing. Because we do what we do and we're in it. It's like forest in the trees thing. And so if you have someone else who's sort of asking about your life and walking through those experiences, they can put things together or see connecting lines that you can't see because you're living it. But the thing is like if an artist is rarely given an opportunity to talk about their life, you know, for an hour and a half or whatever and walk through these things, then how is that ever going to present itself?
Yeah.
You know, you don't get that opportunity.
Yeah, for sure. I want to pause for a second and say, so Brian and I are just going to talk for a while. And then I'll have a few questions for him, like really short questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience for some questions, and then we'll indulge ourselves in some beverages and food. I keep pushing the beverages and food, so feel free to get up and have beverages and food. I want to shift over to some of the prepared questions. So it's not to be formulaic, but I did want to get to some things here. So this seems like a dumb question, and we kind of talked about it, but why write the book? I mean, the podcast exists. You talked about you wanted to have it as a tangible format. Is that really the reason? Did you? I mean, it's a great book, but what's the real? Not that you haven't told me the real why, but what's the why there?
Yeah, I think
why a book?
I think
could have been a movie.
Oh yeah, I didn't get any. Surprisingly, no deals yet.
Okay, well, we can shop this. So really, why the book?
I bring this up in the podcast a lot. I grew up as a kid from Pittsburgh who liked skateboarding, who liked punk rock and hip hop, and in those cultures, ephemera is important. Like the posters, the books, the stickers, and all that. I love something you can hold and touch and look through. That means a lot. And when I was growing up as an artist, and even like when I was in the studios here in the BFA studios, I shared a studio a lot of the times with an artist. His name's Gerald Davis. He lives in the West Coast. And we had books, stacks of books in the studio as we painted. And I'm sure we got paint all over them. And but it was really important. So I think when you hold a book, I love books. I love just the tactile nature of them. But also, you can reference things differently when you dive into a book. It's a different way. And I sort of imagined a book where you could jump in at any point and just, it's almost like an inspiration thing. It's harder to do that with a podcast because it's an audio file. And I don't do video versions. I just do the audio. So it's hard to like jump in and get tidbits. I mean, you could, I guess, but it's not native. I don't feel like that's comfortable to just jump in at like out 1 hour and 15 minutes and just start listening. So the book is kind of like another portal. It's an extension of it. And since it is just an audio format, this puts it into some sort of physical space that people can hold and reference. And also, not everyone listens to podcasts. So this could be a portal into those artists and those ideas, even if they're not into sitting there for an hour and a half listening to, two people talking.
Yeah. So I mentioned this earlier. We talked about this earlier. You have, I don't know how many chapters in here. And they're chapters, 4 or 5 pages. I mean, they're not, 20, 30 pages long. But you haven't transcribed the interview. You're telling the story and you're interpreting or reinterpreting. And in some instances, for me, I'm thinking, like, do you write art criticism? Do you write columns? Have you ever thought about doing that? Because what you're doing is somebody's responding to you, this back and forth. The back and forth isn't necessarily in these chapters. What I read in the chapters is, this is Brian Alfred watching two people, having a conversation, and then you are reporting back and also interpreting. So there's a descriptive piece, there's an interpretation piece, there's also an analysis piece.
Right.
But it comes out in a very seamless way. The question in there is this interpretation? Are you writing criticism? No, are you telling a story? how was the writing piece so smooth for you? Because it comes across as a smooth, readerly book.
A couple of things. One is when it comes to, like, I do write, and often I just write for myself, or I've written pieces on shows that I find really engaging. And like I've had a few things published that I've written on other artists. Like I wrote on Joubert, who's one of my all-time favorite painters. And but I've written and pitched things to, not aggressively, just to a couple people or a couple publications, and sometimes I don't get a response. But I feel like I'm just obligated to do that. But I like writing it to write it. You know what I mean? I like having these conversations to have the conversation. And when I write, I feel like I'm not a talented writer. It's really hard writing.
Writing's really hard.
It's really difficult. It's a different speed, pace, a different gear than painting or making music. It's really separated, and it's difficult. The structural part of it is really hard to format. So I think the reason why I broke it up into selecting a certain amount of artists and then writing it that way is everything I do in my life is I have like a ritual, and like if I go to the gym, it's every day, it's this time, or if I like to do things the same way and then mutate it, work serially through things. When I have a show, I have an idea for the show, and then I work through these images, and then I move to the next. So I believe that my writing sensibility is probably akin to that. So it's introductory in a sense in these essays on these artists, or whatever these chapters. I want to introduce or talk about the artist, and then also reflect a little bit on the conversations, and then talk about the work as well. So it's kind of adding those bits of my experience of like having conversations and gleaning information from that, biographical things, and then also analytical things about the work and how it functions, basically. So it's funny because outside of the book in my life, I have the podcast, which is the conversational. I have the times where I write about things, that's the analytical. And this is a way for me to sort of merge it together.
But it's all part of the same project, though. Yeah. It's all part of the same project.
Well, that's the thing, too, that I learned. When you're an artist and you work with a gallery, you have a relationship, you're going to have a show, you're going to have a goal, you make the work. When you write a book, you have publishers, editors. It's complicated. It's complicated. This is not what I imagined the book to look like, or to come out like.
What did you have in mind?
I don't know. I thought it was going to be funky, like a zine sort of style, and lots more collage-y elements to it. And it sort of over time came into this format. But I did hold on to some of the guest book sketches and some of the funky, funner parts of it, but it's also a little more composed as well.
Yeah. Every once in a while, it's broken up by these yellow
quotes,
sections,
these quotes,
thematic quotes. Right?
Yes. That was always part of the idea.
It was.
Yeah, the thematic quotes and the guest book sketches, like those were always in there. And then this idea of like snippets on artists was in there, but I think working with the publisher and editors, it changed a little bit.
Sure.
So my brother, who's a curator of design at the Denver Art Museum, has done a lot of publications. He's written a lot of, he just did a Charles and Ray Eames book, and it took years. And then my other friend was like a head editor and person at Rizzoli. So I had these great resources to talk to about the process of working with editors, because I'd never done that before. Being an artist is it's very difficult, but it's also, you have so much agency a lot of the times. Like my catalogs, I'm like, I want it to say this, I want this person to write it, I want it to look like this. And they're like, yeah, sure. Yeah. It's like, it's beautiful. And there's no like, are you sure you want to put that there? It's none of that. It's like, yeah, whatever. But working in this, a book is different. Yeah. It's different.
The funky piece that you were talking about, I think the size, this feels kind of like a manga.
I love the size.
Right? The size
I wanted, yeah.
Right? It fits in my jacket pocket, right? It's really easy. It does have funky elements too. You don't often see yellow books with, each of the chapters have different colors on. There's some funk to it. I love the quote sections, like this one, On the Job. This is one of my favorites because people are talking about other jobs that they've had.
Yeah.
And that's part of that art and life piece. That's part of their lived experiences. And so how did you choose which? So here's where the question comes from. In order to do this, you had to remember or have notes for all of the podcasts, and then you had to whittle them down to how many were going to be in here, and then you had to decide which ones you were going to write about. Did you have to listen to all of them over and over again?
Oh, no.
So you memorized them?
No, I just went back to certain things. Like I would, my memory is a little, I don't know if it's, I have weird selective memory where certain things I just remember. Like I can say, if I think about music with my podcast, the first thing I think of is Chris Martin. I don't know if you know the artist Chris Martin. He's amazing. Chris Martin talking to him about Herbie Hancock and the Grateful Dead. Mm-hmm. That I remember. Mm-hmm. There's other things that people will say to me, oh, when you, like from 3 weeks ago, mm-hmm. oh, when you talk to them about this, and like, I don't remember.
That's called getting older.
But I mean, I'm doing this once a week there's like
right.
almost 500 of these,
yeah.
So I can't remember all that. So I went back, and I also had help with the publisher. Yeah. I had, editors who would help me sift through this stuff.
Just fascinating to me, like the amount of material you've created over 8 years, to be able to pare it down and make it have its own new life related to the archives is just amazing.
That's what I meant. The difficulty was also to just editing it down, mm-hmm. to say, okay, here's the artists, here's the quotes. There's so many good quotes. Mm-hmm. There's like...
No, it's filled with quotes. One of my favorite books, when I used to teach, I don't know if I ever told you this, I used to teach Intro to Drawing when I was in grad school.
Yeah, I think I knew that.
Yeah, and my favorite book was by Robert Henri,
mm-hmm.
and just filled with quotes. And every class I'd share a quote or two from that book, and we'd talk about it. So I mean, I could use this book in the same way.
Yeah,
it's filled with really great quotes.
That too. That's part of the reason I wanted to do a book, is because people can use it in a way. You could send a link to a podcast or send a quote or something, but a book could be something that you show or share with the class. Absolutely. And say, check this stuff out.
Yeah.
And then it's different than reading a transcript, because
100%.
So yeah, that's part of it too.
Yeah.
I feel like I started doing the podcast, I don't even know why. I just started doing it. And the thing that I found is one of the most rewarding parts of it is when other people send me emails and they're like, oh, I really love that conversation. Or I knew that artist for like 10 years and I never knew they worked at Wendy's when they were, or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. Like that feels really good. Or a lot of times students will send me, not just students here, but students from other schools will send, oh, I just graduated, and hearing the story about, this person who had to work at this job or something for like 5 years before that makes me feel better. Or it's like good to hear that you can go through that and then come out the other end.
Yeah.
So I think that's a big part of, I don't know if it was the initiative of the podcast ever, but it's been a great thing to come out of it. Mm-hmm. And it's something that I think the book ideally can connect with people in a different way.
I would imagine so. And one of the ways that we know, or we might imagine we can measure, or at least assume to measure the reach or the influence of the book on the podcast on other people, is you get these weekly or monthly ratings from Apple,
mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
iTunes. How Sound and Vision hit
the podcast? So when I got really lucky, because I think it was the first month or the second month that I did Sound and Vision, it was I don't know why, but it was featured on Apple Podcast New and Noteworthy, mm-hmm. which is like on the front page. Mm-hmm. So that kind of, I could just see the number, not necessarily subscribers, mm-hmm. but views and listens and
mm-hmm.
stuff. It just kind of shot out of the gate. It gave it an initial push.
Great.
And one of the best things that Rishi told me about, because I said, well, how do I get this podcast that I do to the right ears? Because artists, that population is a specific population. Mm-hmm. He said the best thing to do is just release them every week, and each person will share it with their network. And then the next week, those people share. And then it starts to just exponentially mm-hmm. get out there, mm-hmm. so to speak. Mm-hmm. So
And then you'll get overlaps at a certain point because this network and that network might have connected nodes in it. Yeah. So you get some depth there.
So in total honesty, I don't really look at my statistics much ever. Although it does pretty well for an art podcast, but I don't really, because I have a sponsorship by Golden Paint and I have a sponsorship by Fulcrum Coffee. That is all I need in life. Free paint and free coffee.
That's it.
Worth the price of admission. And I was doing it for free, and it's not like that's why very rarely I will get an email or a complaint or why didn't you talk about this? Or I remember one time I was driving back from Penn State and I was at the Columbia gas station at the rest stop. And I stopped and got a coffee and I was checking my emails and I got a DM from someone who was like, I love your podcast, but you speak to way more men than women. And I was like, kind of had panic. I was like, oh my God, I didn't mean to do that, And I was really distraught. And then I went back, and this was kind of early on. Maybe I'd done 50 or something, I'm guessing. And I went back, and it was, I think, 26 to 24 or something.
Well, that was a factual critique.
And I was like, so I sent back a message. I was like, thanks for listening. Actually, it's almost 50-50, but I do try to be diverse in the people I speak with. And they were like, oh, sorry, maybe it just seemed like that because the last couple ones were dudes or something.
But they were listening carefully, no, not carefully. They were listening and paying attention enough that they thought, hey, you're onto something. Let me just
guide you in a responsible direction,
Exactly.
which I appreciate.
Exactly.
But part of me thought, I'm not paid for this gig. I'm doing this pro bono.
Sure.
And anytime I get like a critique, which I don't get that many people who are, upset with anything that I'm saying or doing, but I just think to myself, well, you can do your own podcast. If you don't like my way I'm doing it, everyone has one these days. Go for it.
That's
Yeah, I'm trying to do the best that I can.
Yeah, I figured it out. You figured it out too. So, flipping through the book, I recognized numerous names in here. Numerous names, like dozen or so. That's numerous for me, right? And I have two little Post-it notes here on two of them. Page 269. Devin Shimayama.
I've heard of him.
You've heard of Devin? Where did Devin go to school?
Here.
He went here. Yeah.
That's like a fun full circle kind of moment.
Talk to me about that one.
We did that. So, I think if anyone here is related to art, you might know who Devin is. He was a former student here, and he just spoke at the Palmer.
And has work in the Made in PA exhibition.
Yes. So I was fortunate enough when I was here, that was the year you were on sabbatical, I think, and I was covering for you. It was the year that I met Devin as a student here. And some people you just know they have it. They've got the curiosity, the ability. This is amazing. And so whenever he got out there and started doing his thing, I reached out to him and I thought this would be fun to sort of reconnect. And we did that podcast we recorded it at an art fair. God, there's so many of them. It was one of them. I forget which
That's
one.
That's a great answer. It was one of them. I don't know where it went.
It was in Tribeca. But we did it. It was really funny because it took a long time to actually start the podcast because in the booth next to his, they were drilling holes and the drill was like a cannon. So it took a while, but we did that conversation there. And it was really great to sort of reconnect. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the amazing things about, teaching is to see someone come through and that they have this curiosity and this ability, and then to see them go and deliver on that and just dedicate themselves and to accomplish what he's accomplished is amazing. Right. And not surprising, but
it's amazing.
It's a great feeling.
Mm-hmm.
So those are nice whenever I just did one with Alicia Adamerovich, who was my student in figure drawing, but was a graphic design major because she was doing illustration, but there wasn't an illustration major. Mm-hmm. And I remember saying to her, she did not make a bad drawing the entire semester. It was a banger after banger. And I just said, are you sure you don't want to do painting or drawing? Like, you don't want to come over? She says, no, this is my thing. And I always thought, man, the gift is crazy. Mm-hmm. And sure enough, after graduating a couple years, just started making paintings, moved to New York, and is an amazing painter and doing really, really well. Has a solo show up now at Timothy Taylor Gallery, and I just released a podcast with her a couple weeks back, and that's always incredible.
It's gratifying.
Yeah, it is. And it's the funny thing, I feel very connected to Penn State, obviously, because this is where I got my start. Helen was my 250 teacher in beginning painting, and I was doing, I don't know what I was painting. It was probably god-awful, but I was painting still life. I've told this story. I was painting a still life. Everyone's painting a still life. I'm painting like triangles and like weird shapes, and she was just like, this is great. This is amazing. And I was like, I think I could do this.
Yeah. You see, my fingers are inside the book. You're holding 2 pages. This is the one holding Devon.
I mean, it's very on brand for Penn State.
Yes, it is. Page 227, Helen O'Leary. Talk to me about that interview.
I don't remember it.
No?
No.
All right, moving on.
So this is a great story. This is a great story, and great to. That's the thing. You never, as a student, think, like, one day I'm going to interview my professor.
Right.
And I never. If you would have asked me in undergraduate school if I was going to be teaching, or, you know, there's a lot of things that I do, or podcasts weren't even invented. But, you know, there's things that you find along the way that you're interested in, or that you do that you never imagine yourself doing. So it's kind of a cool kind of thing to do that, or to have that experience, you know, to talk to Bob. I mean, I've talked to a lot of people that, like Lisa Kareen Davis, I did a podcast with her, and she was my professor when I was a grad student at Yale. She was one of they sort of bring back relatively recent students to come teach for a year or two or something, and that was the point. I believe she was coming back to teach. And she gave me the business and a critique, because she's like, I don't know how to talk about this, because I haven't been I wasn't invited to a studio, and I was like, I was scared and stuff, and to years and years later to have a sit-down interview and do that, it's a really cool opportunity to, you know, tell that story.
Yeah. So in those moments where you're interviewing a person who was your teacher, I mean, you've interviewed several people who were your professors or teachers. But in that moment, when you're interviewing them, years after they were in that role and you were in that role, are they still is there a moment where, oh, this isn't my teacher anymore, this is just another artist, or do you always have that element of, oh my gosh, this is Helen, she's my professor?
Not at all. Actually, I don't, I'm being honest, I don't have that feeling ever about any teachers. And I think part of that came from when I graduated from graduate school, I immediately went to Skowhegan, Maine for a residency. And at Skowhegan, they have this thing where they're not your teachers. They're participants, or there's participants, and then there's, I forget the word for it, but they always made it a point that, like, these people aren't your teachers, they're fellow artists.
Like co-learning.
Yeah, it was it was great. And then that summer I had Byron Kim, who's one of my greatest mentors, as a, I don't know, mentor or whatever and Tom Friedman and Suzanne McClellan, Lorraine O'Grady, all these amazing, Polly Affelbaum, people that I'm still close with today. And that broke down that wall of, although the teachers that I was lucky enough, most of them, to have, never had that sort of guarded wall of, you know, I'm the teacher, you're the student. It was more of like, hey, we're all artists.
Yeah. Nice. I want to shift now, slide into these 5 questions, and then we'll open it up to this panel of experts.
Sure.
To ask questions. So I have 5 questions for you, Brian. And by the way, I feel like we could just talk for hours. Like I'll just jump in the car with you. Let's drive back to Brooklyn, and I can just talk to you for 5 hours.
Sounds good. Yeah.
No, I'm serious. I always have loved talking to you in your studio, wherever in the hallway. It's always great having a chat with you.
Thank you.
Listen, I have 5 questions. Short answers are good. A little bit longer answers are fine too, but they're intended to be a segue from whatever this conversation was to letting other folks. What's your favorite word?
So my favorite word is komorebi.
Again?
Komorebi.
Komorebi.
Komorebi is a Japanese word for light when it comes through the branches and leaves of trees.
Not
So-
like Tyndall. Light when it comes through the branches of trees. Okay.
Specifically, that's what that word means. So when you see little beams of light coming through the
Yeah.
trees, it's beautiful. There's no word like that
No.
in English.
Say it again. Como
Komodebi.
debi. All right.
And so sometimes when I mention that to people that I know who speak Japanese, or who are Japanese, who aren't fluent in English, they're like, well, what's the English word for that? And there's no light that's coming through trees.
There's an entire sentence or two. Yeah. All right. What's your least favorite word?
All right, this is going to upset, I'm sure, at least one. My least favorite word is liminal. I can't with liminal. I'm sure we've all used, I know I'm not liminal.
No, we're not using it anymore.
I
At
was
least not around you. We're not going to use it.
Are you going to ask me why?
Yes, Brian. Why is liminal?
So the reason why I
your
don't
least
like the word
favorite word?
liminal is because subliminal has meant so much to me over these years, with an absolute ignorance to know that I didn't even know liminal existed.
Yeah.
I just thought it was subliminal. Then all of a sudden, a couple of years ago, liminal comes walking into my life,
just comes-
in my ear holes, and all I hear about is the liminal space about this and that. And then, no, I want it to be subliminal. It's in the back.
Got it. It's not the same relationship with overwhelmed and whelmed, is it?
Is that?
I don't think whelmed is a word.
I thought you just introduced me to my least favorite word. You know what I feel like when I was younger, the equivalent, and I learned it from people telling me, was there's an equivalent word to it. It's, oh my God, I'm going to forget what it is. I feel like in stages when there's a certain zeitgeist with words. Oh, juxtaposition.
Juxtaposition.
Juxtaposition became a really good word when I was in art school to talk about two things that are opposed. And then quickly after that, people told me, like, yeah, we're not going to do that one anymore.
You know when I stopped using that word?
When Juxtaposed magazine came out?
No, it was not there. I was teaching, I used to be an elementary art teacher. And so we use that word with the kids. And
it's a good
we're
word, it
doing
makes sense.
It's great. Until one of the kids said, we're talking about their work, and they said, yeah, and in this work, I put this here and that there. It was just a position.
Juxtaposition. Yeah.
It's not exactly the same. What's your comfort food?
My comfort food. Can it be a tie between two things? I think it's.
Apparently, the answer will be a tie between two things. Yes.
I think it's. Hold on. Probably it's between pho and like a Thai green curry. You know why? I don't know if it's like comfort food, but when I'm overseas for a long time and I come back to Brooklyn, the first thing I order is either pho or Thai green curry.
Like, you've been longing for it,
Yeah.
or like you need to have it to be grounded back?
Both, I think.
Yeah.
It's just the anchor food for me. I'm vegetarian too, so it kind of puts me in a weird spot.
No, put you in a spot to have pho. Or,
Well, my family are carnivores, so it puts me in a weird spot,
well, then
literally.
that does. Yeah. Okay. What is your favorite stadium to watch a soccer game?
It's Kawasaki Frontale. So my cousin, his job is he does film stuff. He does film production. He does film production for J League, which is a professional league in Japan. And often when I go visit, we go to that stadium. And it's beautiful. It's super clean. It's a great place to see a match. And even though it's super clean and the food is amazing, it's raucous. Like, it gets loud. Although I've never been to a Premier League game. So I'm sure if I go to Old Trafford tomorrow,
Yeah,
it'll be
you
my
might change.
favorite.
Yeah.
And I plan to go with my son soon, but I haven't gone yet. So.
Okay. You didn't think I was going to ask you a soccer question, did you?
I didn't.
Yeah, well, I did.
Well played.
You're welcome.
Do you know who's winning right now against Manchester United? And
I do
Pug?
not.
me neither. Anyone?
No, we'll check out.
Yeah.
All right. Listen, Brian. If you were not a visual artist or a podcaster, what would you do? I mean, as a profession, not like, what would you do? Oh, my God.
Right. I think I started off in pre-medicine, and I think now, looking back, I kind of wish I'd stayed I don't wish I'd stayed, I love doing what I do, but I think I wish my current brain, my analytical and curious brain, could have existed back then in my first year at the University of Pittsburgh Medical School, because I feel like it would have been amazing to become a surgeon. But at that stage in my life, I wasn't there. My brain wasn't ready for it. So I got to the place at the wrong time, which is beautiful because I found art and I love doing that. That would be amazing to be in the medical field, just because I'm always really compelled and interested in medicine and the body and all that stuff. But I will soon, not soon, was that out loud? When I retire, when I retire,
Yes.
I will move to Japan and open a
surgical?
a breakfast place, a coffee shop breakfast place that will be open from like 7 to noon.
Yeah.
And then I'll paint the rest of the day, because I love cooking breakfast.
Come on, man.
I love it.
We need to have another conversation, because you know what? In the distant future, if and when I retire,
You gonna open one up?
no, I'm going to have a risotto bar and
Nice.
gallery.
They would go well together. Although you gotta stir them.
You only get, but there's only 2 selections on the menu any given day.
Risotto and art.
No, risotto, 2 different kinds of risottos, and then the art, but only open. Yeah,
That sounds good. I love risotto, and I like making
there
risotto
we go.
as well.
Maybe we need to go into business together. All right, listen, folks. Brian Alfred, Sound and Vision, Why I Make Art, Contemporary Artist Stories About Life and Work. It's time for your questions.
If there are no questions, I can talk for another. This is like
We're just getting
I
warmed
can
up.
keep going.
Yes.
It's kind of a, maybe it's a dumb question, but I mean, since the podcasts come out every week, and, sometimes you're busy, do you ever record multiple podcasts in a week and kind of store them up so that when you're in the middle of final critiques or something, you don't have to do one that week?
Yeah, it's the schedule sometimes dictates how I record them and how often. You know what I mean? So sometimes I'll have a week where I'll do 2, and sometimes I'll skip a week. But generally, they all come out pretty recently after, within the next like 3 weeks. Like I was just in Japan for 2 weeks for a show there. So before I went, I recorded a few. I just set it up so I could, not like in one day or anything, but I set it up so I could record a few. But I don't like to stockpile them, even though actually I would like to have a bunch in my pocket, because I don't have to get like, oh, I got to schedule, But I like for them to be kind of fresh and have, I know we don't really talk about contemporary events that much, or, it doesn't matter if it's 3 weeks or 5 weeks, but I just like the feeling that it's coming out shortly after it happened, because it feels like it's still got that energy to it, It is, I don't really listen to the podcast. I edit it and I listen to it for editing purposes, but I already live the conversation, so I'm not just sitting there super compelled by what I just said like a couple of days ago. But when I do have to go back and listen to an older one for whatever reason, like sometimes I'll bring an artist to a class, have them zoom in, or like as a visiting artist, and I'll go back and listen to a little bit of it so I can remember some of the things that were said in it. And it's always a little strange. It's like time capsule-y in a way. But yeah, I try to release them pretty quickly, and I've never had more than 3 in my pocket.
Nice.
I have heard other podcasts where they talk about, I think it's like actors, if they do, where they're like, yeah, we recorded a whole season, and then they release it all, which must be great. Well, front-loaded, but it must be great once that's done, and you can just trickle them out. But I don't know, I kind of like doing them in the moment.
Nice. Question.
So I know as artists we're constantly digesting what people say in the world around us, and that kind of seeps into our work kind of subconsciously. But was there anything explicitly that anyone said to you, like on your podcast, that made you work in a certain way, like, or even that you tried and it didn't work, or like something that was successful? Did you get inspired by any of your interviewees?
I don't know if there's been anything that changes the way I make my work. I think because I've been, I don't want to, since I've been working so long at what I do and the changes I make and the way things inform my work is more of like a slow drip instead of like a waterfall. So whereas some artists might just change, I'm going to do this, I'm going to pivot and go into something completely different. For me, the change in my work, I think, is incremental. It's slow over time. So I do think I've learned so much talking to all these people. I never thought about that when I started it. It's like, oh, this is going to be a learning experience. No, I just thought, oh, I'm just going to talk to people and enjoy that. I have learned probably as much or more from talking to artists every week than any other education that I've had. It's been really insightful, but not as much, or maybe I can't remember that many, direct things like if you put this in your paint or, whatever. It's not that literal, I think. It's a more general broadening of my scope of thought about the world or art or music or creativity. And the diversity of the people that I've been able to speak with, I think, has informed my brain about just the way I think, which has been really great. And that was one of the COVID things that happened. Because I was doing so many in person, I would say like 90% were in person. So I was either doing them with New York artists or people who were coming through New York. And then when COVID happened, that's gone. So I went to Zoom, and then I could Zoom anywhere. So it was Africa, it was the Far East, it was, Europe. I was doing them from a lot of different places. I just did one from New Zealand. It's opened up the geographical imprint. I didn't realize it at the time necessarily because I really valued sitting here. And there is something great when you're talking to someone face to face. Something else happens. But there is something great too about opening up the pool, the diverse amount of artists from different backgrounds and different places that I think makes up for that. And it is different. Like if there's an artist from, Nigeria who's in New York for a show and you have that conversation, there's a dynamic, but then speaking to people who are living there and are there, I feel like there's a different vibe to that as well. So I really learned to value the ones that the way I do it now, which is over Zoom, and I get way less parking tickets because New York is a pain in the ass to park. And I'm talking for so long, it's like the window for parking rules, it's a disaster.
Let's take one more question and then open it up for beverages and food. Yes?
Did you feed back the written form to the artists for their comments or edits or anything after you had written up the account?
I didn't. I did ask them,
Right.
We did put it through the publisher, that we're going to write this on the work. But we didn't have anyone, the publisher offered that, but to my knowledge, no one wanted to proof what was written about them. So
Either they were busy or they trusted you.
yeah, I would imagine they trusted me. Unless they did and the publisher didn't make me aware of that, which could be a possibility, I guess. But no, I don't recall anyone asking that.
I actually think that's disciplinary.
Yeah, because other...
Artists are not, because I was thinking, there's just a comment that was so refreshing to, when you asked him, how did you choose?
Yes.
He said, I just remembered some. And that's great, and probably, but somebody who's trained differently, I was thinking what I would have done, I would have probably sampled it.
Yeah, and checked
Make
it.
sure I've got enough of each or whatever.
Oh, we did do that.
Yeah, but I think artists may not, I don't know where it comes. Some people always want to see what they're putting out. I think
Right.
artists are much more like...
You know why? Because people write about our work and we have no say in it. So you die to get a review of your work, whether it's positive or negative. You want people to pay attention. And so often when people write about what you're doing, you don't get to proof it. No, the New York Times, if they write about my work, I don't get this. They don't run it by me. I just see it and I'm like, oh boy, or what, You know what I mean? You just get, I had an art forum review and there were a couple things in it. I was like, I don't know. But I wasn't able to say to them, well, actually, I'm trying to do this in my work. You don't get that opportunity. So I think maybe we are a little more like, do your thing, sort of. But I guess when it came to picking the artists, when I go back into my mind about certain people or certain things, certain jump out, but we definitely had, like, I wanted there to be a diversity of medium, diversity of artists, backgrounds, ages, like all that. So that's definitely
clear.
came into play.
Absolutely, it's clear. All right, Brian Alfred, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.